The final dungeon of a Zelda game is supposed to be the pinnacle of the entire adventure, and that is what we are here to rank today.
We're gonna go through every final part of the Zelda games, and while not all of the games have an actual final dungeon, we're still gonna look at and place what we'd call a final staging area onto this list. This means that if there's at least some area or room of importance or significance to the final part of the story, we are gonna rank it, even though we're calling this a final dungeon ranking.
What makes a good final dungeon is how it helped to build up to the final moment of the game, whether it's building up the villain and the final encounter, or just throwing in a bunch of challenges that sums up what the game is about.
Puzzles, enemies, themes. These are just a few things that should challenge you on what you've learned and seen throughout the game to really prepare you for a final encounter. But all the different final dungeons or areas often have each their own thing that makes it special, and we'll explain all of them as we go.
This is going to be a huge list, so let us not waste any more time and just jump into it and rank these from our least favorites to our very favorites. We're the owners of Triforce, I'm Owner 2.
And I'm Owner 1, and this is our final dungeon ranking.
Finding itself on the very bottom of this list is the Temple of the Ocean King from Phantom Hourglass. Now, there is quite a bit to do during this visit to the temple compared to other games, which you will see later in this list, but exactly what does this visit to the Temple of the Ocean King bring us? Pretty much nothing new.
I have defended this dungeon when we compare this to the Tower of Spirits from Spirit Tracks, but I can't defend this part of the dungeon. As a final staging area, Temple of the Ocean King brings nothing new to this particular visit. As you have done earlier in the game, you go through the same rooms over and over, but you're usually able to find shortcuts with your newest item and then you move on to new floors. However, that's not the case here.
It's not the case because there are no new floors or rooms. You reach the same room as your last visit and go through all the necessary rooms you have done multiple times before, where the only new part is walking through the door at the very end. Sure, there are a few more phantoms to face, but that's pretty much it, which makes this one very disappointing.
Hey, linking the Oracle games together, that's a thing, right? That's something we never did when we were younger, or even when we played the Oracle games for the purpose of this channel. But we have now, and the Room of Rites is, well, pretty contentless.
The Room of Rites does get some points because it's a new place for you to see when you first get there, and it appears to be the place where Twinrova have been hiding and where they would resurrect Ganon, with this being the arena to the, well, sort of true final boss of the Oracle games.
But to get to the Room of Rites, you're just teleported to the place after beating both games with the connection of a password, and all you need to do to find the boss room is to figure out one puzzle to get through a maze of rooms. There are 10 statues looking to the total of 3 different directions, with one direction always being ignored. That's the path you're supposed to take.
And once you figure that out, it's all straightforward. After doing this and going through a number of rooms, you'll end up at the boss room. It's a new place compared to the Temple of the Ocean King, but still barely making the spot above it.
Okay, where are we even supposed to begin with Vaati's Palace? This place has had us confused for so long, because whenever we try to look up how different the 3 versions behind the locked doors in the Anniversary Edition on our 3DSs supposedly were, we could never figure out if there was even one consistent Vaati's Palace.
We also wanted to see if there were differences between the GBA version and the Anniversary Edition, and since we never had the chance to play 4 Swords on GBA legally, we look up on YouTube. And what do you know, on 2 different playthroughs from the beginning to end, Vaati's Palace had different layouts even between those 2 GBA runs.
So when we decided to just play the game again on our 3DSs, we checked our last save file and saw what kinds of levels we would get there. We looked, and then we tried to remember how it looked. And then we started a new save file. When we reached Vaati's Palace again, we ended up with a completely different layout than in the previous save file. even though we entered the first door both times.
So we learn that there's a certain number or something of different layouts that's randomly generated whenever you enter Vaati's palace. It's hard for us to say anything, but basically we want to count the first time we get there, which means we count the levels that are high up in the sky. Does it feel like Vaati's palace?
Yes, cause it's up in the sky and it belongs to the Wind Mage himself. But does it feel like a final dungeon or staging area?
No, not really. The music is so cheerful, and there's nothing here that makes us feel like we're about to go up against the final boss.
What it offers though is puzzles and cooperation that sure can be fun, but nothing that really differs from the previous stages in the game.
This place was a huge mess to figure out for a list like this, but from our conclusion at this moment, it won't make any higher than 18. The Windfish's egg in Link's Awakening is our number 17, and while it is very similar to the Room of Rites, we do think it has a few points that make it better and especially more memorable, also compared to Vaati's palace.
Of course, it being an egg is already making it very unique, but instead of learning the solution to the puzzle inside the place, like the Room of Rites, you find the answer in a library close to Mabe Village. It's in the same place where you find a lot of tutorials for how to play the game, meaning that you can learn it very early on, and that this mysterious hint probably will stay in your memory while you're on your journey.
Alongside the hint, the egg itself is of course something you know about from the very beginning. You hear about it early on, and you can even go see it early on. But hello, it's even in the title screen.
This made your final destination a familiar thing, something you learn about early on, leaving you to know exactly what your goal is, which we think is very interesting. And even though the solution to the puzzle is you just walking up, left, right or whatever the game tells you to do, which seems to be different every time you play, the inside of the Windfish's egg is pretty eerie and something we really think deserves its place above the 3 previous ones on this list, even if we're looking for much more than that for a final staging area to fully enjoy it. Sticking with the Game Boy games here, at number 16 we have Onyx's Castle. This one ranks above the Windfish's egg because while it too is a place you can come close to from an early point in the game, it also has a bit more to offer than just a maze.
It's not that much more though, but at least it throws some enemies and a mini-boss at you. You have to walk straight upwards and fight off all enemies you can, while if you go left or right, you can restock your health with a fairy, but might also have to break a few tiles in the process.
So the challenge is there, but what makes this place feel so much more important is that the area the castle exists in has another atmosphere compared to the overworld. As soon as you get close to it, there's another tone in the environment, music and enemies. And if you do try to enter the castle, a strong force that protects it will just throw you away, making this a place that you know you can only enter when you're strong enough.
And right next to Holodrum, we find Labrina in Oracle of Ages and the Black Tower at number 15.
Starting out with the name of Ambi's Tower, this building actually has an interesting backstory. 400 years in the past, Queen Ambi started building this tower to guide her love, who turned out to be captain of the skeleton pirate crew seen in the Oracle of Seasons, back home. The tower would turn out to be big and very visible, and she could scout the lands from it.
However, in the present, the villain Veren possesses Nehru and goes back to that time and convinces the queen to build a tower tall enough to reach the heavens, making her look like the greatest queen ever. However, with the ability to use the powers of Nehru, the Oracle of Ages, Veren makes the day stand still and have the people work all day so that she will reach her own goal, to bring in the Age of Shadows with the help of the tower reaching the heavens. With the workers being unhappy with working all the way through a never-ending day, they started calling it the Black Tower.
And we know we're supposed to talk about the final parts of the game, and we'll get to that, but we also think a strong backstory makes a final staging area or dungeon great. It's just interesting to us that this place is something you visit very early on, and you get to see it both in the present and 400 years in the past while it's under construction, where you even get to help out by being handed a shovel, in addition to it being gradually constructed and reaching ever so closer to the heavens.
So the backstory is there and it's great, which makes this one look very promising, but then there's the actual dungeon part, and it's rather disappointing. It does offer a little more than Onyx's castle, but not all that much. You enter the tower in the past and you get to walk up from the outside at first and then the inside afterwards.
You ascend the tower while seeing a lot of enemies, but the thing with the enemies is that you can easily avoid so many of them. You then go through a little maze of staircases inside the tower before going outside again. There's really not much to the combat or puzzles here, so it ranks low because of that, but higher than the ones beneath because of the backstory of this tower.
Triforce Heroes did something similar to the Four Swords games by having you go through levels instead of having an overworld to explore in. And the last world is the Sky Realm, with the last level called Sky Temple being the one we count for this list.
The path ahead here is very linear, and you don't solve puzzles here, but move from platform to platform to fight off enemies on different terrains. And the variation is good here, with water as a hindrance, lava, ice, sand. It's all pretty good and can be challenging, and especially for a single player.
But in multiplayer, this is just plain fun. This final stage doesn't do much for us atmospherically or anything, but it's fun to fight off a big variety of different enemies we fought before in a gauntlet like this. The layout allows you to find the right items that might be necessary to beat a few enemies, but what makes this more fun is that you get to pick among a big selection of items at the very beginning of every stage.
And this allows you to choose something you think will help you out in the battles to come. Maybe you feel like the bow and arrow is the best item to defeat enemies with, or maybe the grip shot would be good, because some of the islands do allow you to use it for practical movement. It's not all amazing, but still good fun and ups the challenge right before you face off with the final boss of the game. Like the Temple of the Ocean King and Phantom Hourglass, the Tower of Spirits is what we like to call a hub dungeon. A dungeon you come to visit in the time between other dungeons. But instead of going through the same floors every visit before making progress inside, you just start with taking the next floor after the last one on your previous visit.
In that regard, it was somewhat better than the Temple of the Ocean King, but what made the final part so much better was the fact that you got to explore new floors and rooms for this last visit. And interestingly enough, you always had to work your way upwards this tower in all previous visits, but this time you get to the top from the outside and make progress downwards.
The puzzles don't differ too much from previous visits, but it offers some tougher ones with sand, darkness, lava and other things, along with more phantoms and other enemies to take on. This time though, you don't need to collect the Tears of Light before attacking the phantoms, as your Locomo Sword can take care of them.
While it is only the final part we're looking for at this particular ranking, there's no denying that the actual tower itself plays a significant role in this game altogether, making this worthy of the 13th place. Four Swords Adventures was another game with levels, but the game ended with a type of dungeon, in the Palace of Winds. The dungeons in this game didn't follow all traditions, like having a map and a compass and all that, but at least they created big buildings that both look like and feel like dungeons.
Palace of Winds is no exception, and it definitely feels like a final dungeon, as the music inside is instantly recognizable by being Ganon's theme, and both statues and wall decorations are all made after Ganon. It's all Ganon themed, which is all fitting with this being the last level before facing off with Ganon. Oh, and Vaati, of course.
The puzzles are fine and clever, where some need you to think between the two dimensions between the TV and GBA screen, different kinds of mazes, and of course some playing on one of the main mechanics of the game, the Dark World.
To advance through the main room, you have to find 4 of these orbs to enter the Dark World and have each link press a button, and that requires you to go to 4 different corners of the dungeon to retrieve these, and that's something we enjoy.
And it's not over after this either, as you get to fight Hinoxes in a bouncy environment, Gomas on the other side of a huge gap, and solve another few puzzles. It's not one of the best or most memorable final dungeons in the series, but it sure was a decent ending to this underrated game.
When it comes to final staging areas in Zelda that aren't really dungeons, we don't find any that do it better than the moon in Majora's Mask. while at first glance it doesn't seem to have much content, with there only being a tree in a green, sunlit field with the sounds of birds and with 5 kids wearing masks around the tree. There's just so much more behind all of this.
It's just such a weird contrast coming from Clocktown, where the chaos of the world's end is about to come, to then come into this place. That this sphere with such a hideous face could have something so beautiful inside is just unreal. The sounds is definitely one of the bigger contrasts, as well as the music right before entering this place is very stressful and chaotic, but inside there's just silence, only interrupted by natural sounds from the winds and birds, and the occasional rumbling.
You can talk to all of these kids, but notice that there's something strange about all of them. 4 of them are wearing the masks of the 4 bosses and are running around the tree, and one of them is sitting next to the tree wearing Majora's mask. What's really strange is that they all look like young, happy mask salesmen behind the masks, and some of them even ask you if you'd become one. Weird.
They all talk about friendship, much like Skull Kid himself do when it comes to Tattle, Tail and the 4 giants at the end of the game. But they all also want to play with you. The 4 running around will play as long as you trade in a certain number of masks, and you'll go through a dungeon sequence that somewhat bases itself on the dungeon that matches with the mask they're wearing.
So it's not like the moon is without its dungeon parts, but you need all the masks in order to play through all of these sequences and in the end get the final one, the Fierce Deity mask. These challenges are all kind of fun and only add to the quality of the moon.
The one wearing Majora's mask is the one who takes you to the boss room to fight off with the 3 forms of Majora. You can always go straight to him, but as mentioned, there is more to this place if you collect masks and talk to the other children. The strongest point here, though, is the symbolism and questions around ethics. We're not the right ones to explain all of this, but let us just say that this is a great ending to the weird and twisted world of Majora's Mask, as it fits right in with everything we've experienced up until this point. Now we're entering the territory of real dungeons, and we're starting with the final one from Zelda 2, Adventure of Link, the Great Palace.
This place really feels like a final test, as this palace is incredibly dangerous and hands down the most difficult final dungeon in the entire series. At least it is for us. The place is filled with enemies that are just simpler to try to avoid rather than fight, but sometimes even avoiding them can be harder than the actual fight, so even deciding what you want to do to them is a struggle.
If that wasn't already enough, just knowing where to go is a crazy task. The place is huge and confusing, and getting to a dead end is not uncommon. That can be wasteful, as trying to reach the end, let alone fighting Thunderbird and or Shadow Link on 3 lives, can sometimes feel impossible.
It's not our favorite place, as we've gotta admit that we've never beaten this place without the help of a map, which this game completely lacks, mind you. And the reason for that is because losing a life in this game is so much easier than in others. Not only are the enemies really powerful and a lot of magical effects only last for 1 screen, which means it's easy to waste your magic before you need it in more important situations, like the bosses, but you can lose one of your 3 lives just by falling down one of the many pits here, unlike other Zelda games.
So the place sounds like a huge pain, which it can be, but we like that it's really challenging, which it should be for an already hard game before you face off with the final bosses. But it really helps that you at least start at the beginning of the dungeon and not in the overworld, which is something this one did right, compared to the rest of the dungeons in the game. This might just come down to our preference of a milder difficulty, but level 9, also known as Death Mountain from the original Zelda game, also was a giant maze with tough enemies to fight in.
But to us, this one felt better paced and a bit easier to navigate, leaving us with a sort of correct amount of difficulty. The enemies are of course really hard, but it felt more manageable, especially with the right equipment. That can be said about all dungeons obviously, but the last time I went through this to record what you're seeing now, I was just enjoying myself.
With about 2 to 4 ways to exit almost every room, we had plenty of ways to go, but we could always make shortcuts and look at the map to make our own path so much easier than we could in Zelda 2, while at the same time find it challenging enough. This dungeon really differs from the previous dungeons in the game as well, with its ominous music and map layout that's shaped like a skull, truly worthy of its name.
All in all, going through this maze filled with some of the toughest enemies you've faced so far, and even with new enemies or even mini-bosses if they are that, and giving us what we feel is a really good amount of difficulty is something we really count as a good final dungeon.
At number 8 we placed Ganon's Tower from Wind Waker. This really is an ominous final dungeon that's split into two major parts. The first one consists of 4 different areas mimicking 4 of the dungeons you've been through, with its bosses at the end of each. Contrary to belief for some, this is actually something we enjoy seeing in a final dungeon. We like having some sort of elements from previous parts in the game combined into the last parts of the game, at least in some sense.
Wind Waker did this decently well, even though some of these areas didn't do all that much. The puzzles weren't all that good, and they felt really short. The boss battles don't seem to have been made more difficult either, but the idea might just be that they'll make you feel stronger because they're easier to beat when you're at this level. If so, it's well done, and taking away the colors and kind of twisting up the battle themes changed the atmospheres of these boss encounters entirely, which was appreciated.
The second half is so much more cryptic and mysterious. You got 2 rooms with lanterns and switches to make a portal out of the tower, and then there's the maze with Phantom Ganon. The point is to follow wherever the hilt points as the sword falls down after each encounter with Phantom Ganon. While this is a cool thing, this also feels small for a second half of a final dungeon, even if it takes time to really understand what you're supposed to do.
What this final dungeon does really well though is creating an atmosphere fit for the end of the game. Everything from the locations you find yourself in to the grey, nightmarish feeling of the rematches against the earlier bosses, and especially to the music, creates this foreboding feeling. Both themes played in the different halves sound great and plays a big part in creating this atmosphere. In the end, you have the stairway to Ganondorf's lair, which gets some points with the tough enemies leading up to the final battle, and this time, there's no music at all, except when you're in the battle. Add the fact that it's next to Hyrule Castle at the bottom of the ocean, which is also worth mentioning as a really cool thing. We gotta say that it has a lot of strengths in its atmosphere, but falls a bit short with the less exciting tasks and puzzles overall.
Probably more known for its music than the actual dungeon itself, Lorule Castle lands on number 7 spot. In some ways, this dungeon is really similar to Ganon's Tower in Wind Waker, and in some ways it does it better, and worse. Namely, the atmosphere isn't as strong here, while the puzzles and contents are better, in our opinion.
Even though Lorule overall has been dealing with chaos ever since they got rid of the Triforce, we think it's a bit odd that their castle is filled with so much lava. However, that just adds to the danger when we think of the gameplay. The music, while great, does make the place feel a little less like a final dungeon, as there's not much of a threatening presence coming from it. Still, it's also important to remember that this used to be, more or less, a regular castle like Hyrule Castle, so in that regard, the music doesn't need to feel all that ominous. It did make us want to push forward though, as the music evolves with a more triumphant, heroic sound the more we progress.
What's similar is that you actually face off with 4 bosses at the end of 4 different paths, but only 2 of them have been bosses in their own dungeons, while the 2 other have just been sort of stronger enemies or mini-bosses. But the puzzles you have to solve in order to get to these bosses are better, and more fun than in Wind Waker, in our opinion.
They don't correspond to the dungeons some of the end enemies and bosses have been found in before, but at least they offer up a little more challenge, whether it's leading a huge bomb through a maze with walls that need to be raised and lowered, leading a huge spiked ball on a path that ascends from the lava only if you're next to it, using the hookshot on a raft while a wallmaster is following you, or the coolest one, walking through dark rooms with paths that are only visible while it's dark.
It's not the most atmospheric final dungeon, but a good challenge at the end of the game, and being in the bizarre version of Hyrule Castle leading up to the final encounter was a good way to end A Link Between Worlds.
A Link to the Past's final dungeon was solid. While Ganon's tower didn't offer all that much atmospherically, as it had the same dungeon theme as the previous 7 in the Dark World and nothing too special when it comes to colors and interior, it sure made up for complexity, use of items, puzzles, and combat.
The entrance offers 3 doors with 2 leading down and 1 up. Even though you can't reach too far in all directions, it's still welcome to us that you're able to walk in multiple directions and explore from the beginning. We continue to discover that there aren't many linear paths, as some rooms allow you to teleport to completely other floors and rooms, which just adds to the excitement we have for this dungeon.
The tower spans over 7 floors and a basement, and offers puzzles that both require a few items, and others that give you different options to make it convenient for you. When it comes to combat, it doesn't throw hordes of enemies towards you, but rather place a few sort of tough ones in circumstances that will complement the challenge, which definitely can be a little difficult.
Not to mention that the dungeon also includes the 3 dungeon bosses from the Light World, that also had new circumstances to offer, where you face the Armor's Knights on a floor of ice, the Land Mola while one of these annoying things bother you from the corner, and Moldorm on an even more narrow platform. Honestly, we think this is great, seeing something familiar in a new setting in a final dungeon.
It's a very enjoyable and decently tough final dungeon to go through, but we can also see that it's not the best. As we mentioned, the atmosphere is a bit weak, as the most it has is the occasional Ganon statues and faces on the walls, and of course the Triforce logo here and there. But the lack of a unique dungeon theme surely is a big disappointment to us, which is part of the reason why I didn't make it higher than number 6.
We find the best 2D final dungeon to be in the Minish Cap with Dark Hyrule Castle. It's really cool how you enter the elemental sanctuary in the basement of Hyrule Castle to gain the last bit of power of the Four Sword, and then go out to see the whole castle had suddenly turned dark.
Roaming through these halls feels eerie, and they did a good job with the atmosphere here. The music is a good rendition of the original Hyrule Castle theme from A Link to the Past, and the colors, enemies, and wall decorations all fill the castle with this sort of evil presence.
It's interesting how we even find the king himself in the dungeon of the castle, locked up behind bars and turned into a statue, like the soldiers and the minister when they first walk out of the elemental sanctuary.
But one of the things that makes us like this place so much, looking away from its atmosphere, is that the size of the place is pretty big, and you need 4 keys to remove a block hindering you from getting the big key. These 4 keys are found in the 4 towers at each corner of the castle, and what's standing between you and them are different numbers of dark nuts to fight off, and they really offer up a challenge in this game.
In addition to this, there's all kinds of different puzzles, ranging from making 4 copies of yourself using the Four Sword, a bomb puzzle that can be solved in many ways, a floor tile puzzle like the ones in the Oracle games, and hey, there are even outside parts too, with only darkness shown beneath the heights.
It does not have much of the things we've seen previously in the game like we appreciate, but they did throw in a bunch of really cool and challenging enemies, and we have a final dungeon that's strong in atmosphere, has good variety in puzzles and use of items, in addition to a well thought out goal and usage of space. Skyward Sword had an interesting case of a final dungeon in more ways than one. The Sky Keep is the place where you gather the 3 pieces of the Triforce, but not the place where you face the final boss, or even Girahim. Still, it's the last dungeon and has a purpose that leads you to the conclusion of the entire game, so this one is still very interesting as a final dungeon.
The other thing is of course that the whole dungeon itself is literally one big puzzle. There are 8 rooms in total, and in some of them you find a panel where you can shove the rooms around and change the entire layout of the dungeon by yourself. That is an amazing concept. The puzzle itself here is pretty challenging and really makes you think, cause it's not like there's an exit on all 4 sides of every room, and even if there were, you're not guaranteed to go through all exits from any door you enter, as some rooms have doors that have restricted paths leading to them.
And even though the dungeon lacks a boss, it does still offer up a big variety of enemies, as well as our favorite mini-bosses in the game, those being the Stallmaster and Servo, but we got another one called Dreadfuse here instead.
Of course, we have to mention how much we love the fact that the different rooms act as the different dungeons in the game, and even dividing the 2 halves of the ancient cistern into 2 separate rooms. The puzzles here are also well done, and often work in the same fashion as they did in the respective dungeons, only with new layouts that at times are more difficult to solve.
The environment and atmospheres then become very varied, but still remain familiar. It becomes a great mix of the surroundings, fun puzzles, item usage, and enemies that we enjoyed previously, all put into this very compact final dungeon. "7 years in the future, where the proud and beautiful Hyrule Castle once stood, a new and much darker castle has risen. Ganon's castle and all of its surroundings in Ocarina of Time is such a gigantic contrast to the green, sunshine-filled area that used to be there."
Already there we're off to a good start, but the actual dungeon itself does things well too. It's basically divided into 2 parts, where the first is very puzzle oriented and divided up to 6 wings, where each of them is somewhat related to the 5 adult dungeons and the Temple of Time, with all the sages waiting at each end.
Each part has to be cleared, where you and the sages have to dispel each part of the barrier keeping you from entering the tower leading to Ganondorf. Already, this is a cool concept. Every sage you've spent your adult life rescuing play their parts inside this dungeon, helping you out with clearing a path to the evil man who has Zelda in his possession.
Most of these parts have elements from their respective dungeons, but there's also theories about how some of these parts, with the forest and water being at least 2 of them, were planned to have different elements from what the forest and water temple ended up having in this game, as the forest part has wind puzzles and the water part having ice, which seems to reflect the symbols on their medallions.
But that's digressing a bit too much. We really enjoy having a first half like this, where the atmosphere is very calm with the low music, and the meetings with the sages feeling important. There's just something eerie about all of this, but it only gets better from this stage as well.
As you enter the tower after the whole barrier has gone down, it all becomes about combat. As you go up the stairway to Ganondorf and fight off different group of enemies, as the ominous theme of Ganon himself just gets louder and louder the closer you get to the top.
This part is just super atmospheric, because the music is never interrupted by the combat. Whenever you fight the Dynalfos, Stalfos, and Iron Knuckles, you don't hear any combat music. You only hear the faint sound of Ganon's theme in the background. This only continues until you've ascended high enough to enter the room where Ganondorf awaits you.
This final dungeon did not do much wrong, if anything at all, but when it comes to a final dungeon, it should be the highlight of the entire game. But in our opinion, this game had such an amazing lineup of dungeons already, which we feel were more of a highlight by themselves than a final dungeon, which is a part of the reason why it's not making the top spot. Still, though, when we look at this final dungeon by itself, it did one hell of a job making the final part of the game feel epic.
We mentioned the word highlight in the previous part about Ganon's castle in Ocarina of Time, and if there was one such final dungeon that fits that description in a game, then it's Hyrule Castle from Breath of the Wild. After spending over 60 hours doing the main quest, going through the divine beasts that I have very mixed feelings about, and especially after spending many hours after doing most of the main quest and just exploring around in the different landscapes and natural areas, looking for shrines and Korok seeds, it was an absolute delight to enter Hyrule Castle.
This place is freaking huge and just feels grand. It's got a ton of areas and rooms to explore, both on the outside and the inside. When it comes to combat, the place is filled with a lot of the same enemies as you find in the overworld, but there's a lot more of them here, and more of the powerful ones, including Lynels. The outside area has a very linear path you can go, where you'd face off with a few of these Lynels, but if you look more around, you'd see that there is a whole lot to miss out on if you just walk straight up to the final boss.
And we definitely suggest for you to explore this area, because there are so many cool things to see. A lot of the versions of Hyrule Castle in the series have had pretty limited areas to explore. They always seemed more like a dungeon rather than a place where the royal family actually lived. But if there ever was a castle you could see as the royal family's home, it's definitely this one. You'll find a dining hall, a library, a dock underground, even Zelda's own room. Sure, it's all ruined, but this is a Hyrule Castle that's never been seen before in the series.
You even have a real dungeon part, with cells and everything. This place also houses a few mini-bosses, like the Stalnox that guards the Highland Shield. Exploring this whole place the first time took us hours, but it was worth it. It was so cool to sneak around, take out enemies and even doing a few side quests for people in the outside world, like finding recipes from a cookbook. Hell, it even has its own shrine inside this place. There are also secret passageways and even a king study that's well hidden, and not to mention more Korok seeds. There's just so much to find.
It's really up to you if you want to go through with all this, as you can skip a lot of it. But just the fact that it's all there makes this final dungeon a complete joy to us. It's filled with interesting things, and when you add the incredible music, it's just a fantastic ending to a game that has its ups and downs, and one of the best representations of Hyrule Castle ever in the series. Yes, one of. Hyrule Castle, Twilight Princess. Sure, it wasn't as open and big as the one in Breath of the Wild, and it wasn't shown as much as a home for the royal family, but it sure was a good start. We'll talk more about it as we go, because we really want to go through this dungeon from beginning to end, as one of the things it did so well and so right was building up the tension.
It starts off in the courtyards outside the castle. It's still daylight and the sky is covered with white and grey clouds. You hear no background music, and you only hear the sounds of the rain pouring down. You solve puzzles to open gates, find treasure chests, fight enemies and even King Bulblin for the last time. There's even this haunting place in the back where you solve a sort of cryptic puzzle by the help of the ghost of dead soldiers, which only adds to the atmosphere of this place.
As soon as you get in, you find this very empty and chilling main room of the castle, with a sort of unsettling mix of A Link to the Past's Hyrule Castle theme and Ganon's theme playing in the background. More enemies come to fight you, and as you progress, you find tougher enemies with the likes of Darknuts in the hallways in the back. The decorations in this place are beautiful, with chandeliers, lanterns, paintings, carpets, empty armors and everything.
You go a bit outside again, but to a few of the towers this time, as you see the resistance coming to your aid. It's a fine touch, but honestly, they did so little that it almost felt unnecessary in some ways too. Things may have been unsettling already, but the tension definitely rises when Link starts to ascend the main tower. More cryptic puzzles occur with the help of ghosts, and the music sounds darker.
And as you keep ascending, you can hear that you're getting ever so closer to the main threat of the game, as the sound of Ganon's theme just gets stronger and stronger. You start to see the flashes of lightning and hearing the sound of thunder outside as you fight off more of Ganondorf's minions. And the atmosphere is just off the roof when you walk outside and hear the wind blowing and see the skies have turned really dark while you were in that tower, as Ganondorf is sitting and waiting, almost impatiently.
We think this has been done so well, building up the tension, the atmosphere and even our excitement as we progress through this castle. While you could just skip everything and go straight to the boss with a few inconveniences in Breath of the Wild, there's no way around it in this game. You can't skip the atmosphere and tension in this dungeon.
And how could we forget the way we entered the castle, with Midna unleashing her powers with the fused shadows and breaking through the huge barrier as some sort of insanely powerful creature. Hyrule Castle offers a variety of puzzles, both with a lot of different items and human and wolf form, and what we find really interesting here is that the final dungeon is Hyrule Castle, almost completely intact. No castle filled with lava, no castle completely taken over by darkness, no castle mostly laid in ruins, no castle replaced with Ganon's own, just Hyrule Castle, mostly still standing, is what we find to be the best final dungeon in this Zelda series. Sorry for the long wait, but we hope it was worth it, cause this was a lot of work. If you do think it was worth it, leave us a like, and of course leave your own list in the comments.
We'd like it if you subscribe as well, but after this huge video, we have to slow things down a bit and go for something smaller, and have the next video be our top 5 desert themes. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you then.